as I was saying at the end, the uh, the construction of this group as a model minority can come with some serious pressures. If you're from this group and you aren't successful, then it's kind of blamed on you, and there's something deficient about yourself. It doesn't take into consideration that you might be part of the group that started out in a disadvantaged position and therefore did not receive benefit of uh, wealth and privilege that is usually the case with children coming from advantaged families. Chinese and Japanese immigrants arrived in America at about the same time uh, as immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. But the barriers to upward mobility for European immigrants fell away more rapidly than barriers for immigrants from Asia. Of course, this is most likely due to the visible characteristics of the group and their failure to share some of the cultural aspects of being from Europe or Southern or Northern Europe or Northern or Southern Europe. So whereas the cultural linguistic markers that identified Eastern and Southern Europeans faded with each passing generation, the racial characteristics of the Asian group continued to separate them from the larger society. Immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe entered the industrializing East Coast economy, where they took industrial and manufacturing jobs that gave them and their descendants the potential for upward mobility in the mainstream economy. On the other hand, Asian Americans' exclusion from the mainstream economy was reinforced by overt racially based discrimination from both employers and labor unions. Some Asian groups rank far above racial minority groups on all the commonly used measures, as we've talked about before. However, if we also observe the full range of differences within each group, for example, the bipolar nature of occupations among Chinese Americans, we see that the image of success has been exaggerated and it needs to be placed in a proper context. The relative success of Chinese American and Japanese Americans has become a device for scolding other minority groups. The social class differences between those groups today flow from their respective situations in the past. So you can't really look at Asian Americans in the same way that you look at African Americans, Native Americans, and in some respects, Hispanic Americans. Their cultural situations, their contact situations were different, and it allowed for different outcomes. So many of the occupational and financial advances made by Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans have been due to the high levels of education achieved by their second generations. At the time that native-born Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans reached educational parity with whites, the vast majority of African Americans, Native Americans, and Mexican Americans were still being victimized by Jim Crow laws and legalized segregation, which ultimately excluded them from opportunities for anything but rudimentary education. So the structural explanation is not consistent with traditional views of assimilation. What that means is that Asian Americans' experiences are a bit different than Native American, African American, and Mexican Americans. The immigrant generation of Chinese and Japanese Americans responded to the massive discrimination they faced by withdrawing, developing ethnic enclaves, and becoming invisible to the larger society, albeit successful. Like Cuban Americans, Chinese Americans, and Japanese Americans used their traditional cultures and patterns of social life to create and build their own sub-communities from which they launch the next generation and continue to isolate themselves. And by isolating themselves somewhat from the larger society, they're able to protect themselves as well.